see everyone here today. A landscape that played a quintessential role in the history of North America, a city that single-handedly contributed to the development of the great state of Texas, and one of the most requested major cities that we have not dove into yet on the channel. Today, our video will focus on the great southern metropolis of Houston, Texas. These photographs are mostly from the archives of the University of Houston and have not been posted anywhere else online until today. The oldest photographs of Houston will provide the imagery as we attempt to peel back the proverbial veil and pinpoint the aspects of the mainstream narrative which warrant a deeper analysis. In modern times, Houston is the most populated city in the state of Texas, home to over 2,300,000 people, making it not only the largest city in Texas by population, but also the largest city in the entire American South, and the fourth largest city in the entire United States after New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Houston sits just outside Galveston Bay, near the Gulf of Mexico, and Houston is an absolutely massive city at just over 670 square miles in size. Houstonians, for example, share 4 unique area codes just to cover the entire city, which is the 9th largest city by land area covered, or the 9th most expansive city in the entire United States. How could a city so sprawling and deemed to be so historically significant have arose so rapidly? According to the current narrative, Houston was occupied for at least 2,000 years before Europeans arrived, being home to the Karankawa and Atacapa people, and this is used to explain the presence of ancient monuments, earthworks, and other anomalies that were found in Houston upon European settlement. However, this plausible deniability seems to extend beyond normalcy, as we are told while the Karankawa and the Atacapa people developed Houston from BC times onward, by the year 1700, when Europeans began to settle in and around Texas, these two tribes were almost completely absent. We are told Houston, in particular, was uninhabited or abandoned from the year 1700 through roughly 1830, although the European settlers did discover many earthworks and relics. The Karankawa were considered completely extinct by the mid-1800s, while the Atacapa people were numbered at 9 total individuals in 1908 and now are all but considered extinct. The European history of Texas appears to begin on the heels of the Texas Revolution, when 2 brothers and real estate promoters, John Kirby Allen and Augustus Chapman Allen, arrived to Texas to further their landhold over the Galveston Bay. After making offers on nearby tracts of land, on August 26, 1836, the brothers purchased half a league of land, or roughly 2,214 acres, from the widow of John Austin for $5,000. This terrain would become Houston. Here is where we come to our first major anomaly, which, at least in my opinion, begs a little bit more questioning. Just 4 days after their purchase, the brothers Allen then purchased an advertisement in the Telegraph and Texas Register, the second newspaper ever founded in Texas. Now make of this what you will, but the Telegraph and Texas Register began publication in October of 1835, just days after the outbreak of the Texas Revolution. Now, the electric telegraph, as we know it in our timeline, was not invented until 1837 by Cook and Wheatstone. Before this time, telegraphs, or long-distance messaging, was only accomplished through optical telegraphs, a series of stations, typically towers, for the conveying of messages through use of visual signals. We're told towers would be constructed every handful of miles, and someone with a telescope would view the signal from the previous tower, before sending the same signal to be viewed by the next tower and passed onward. We're told telegraphs existed in this capacity for nearly 100 years before becoming electrified. For Texas's second newspaper to be named after the telegraph before electric telegraphs were even invented, this leads me to believe that Texas, and possibly Houston, might have had an ancient series of tower-like structures, possibly even more like castle-like structures, which could have been inherited by the first European settlers who arrived here. Back to the history of Houston, in 1836, Before the land was even surveyed, the brothers Allen had begun lobbying the Texas Congress to designate the land as a town, under promise that they would personally found multiple massive government buildings there. By November 30th, the Texas Congress voted on which of 15 inherited lands in Texas would become the next seat of government. After multiple ballots, Houston was chosen. What's remarkable, essentially, we're told Houston developed amidst the Industrial Revolution, with the first settlers to the land arriving by the steamship known as Laura in January of 1837. We're told at that time, Houston was somehow an empty and overgrown tract with only 12 residents and one permanent house. Yet, by May of 1837, Houston had already grown to over 1,500 people and over 100 permanent stone and wood houses. This all occurred in less than 4 months. The Buffalo Bayou, on which Houston sits, was utilized by smaller steam vessels to continuously ship European settlers into the city. Also, by May of 1837, the Texas Congress met for the first time in Houston. Again, we have to read between the lines, but it appears that Houston either grew so rapidly that it could not be governed, or the multitude of structures may have already existed in some capacity upon European arrival. Either way, by June of 1837, Houston was incorporated by the Texas government, and Houston had become infamous by that time for dueling, brawling, gambling, public intoxication, and all forms of violence and sin. This was very interesting given the fact that the entire city, in the narrative that we see, was built from scratch and was less than 1 year old. In November of 1838, the Houston Chamber of Commerce was formed to control the more undesirable aspects of the city. By 1839, yellow fever had claimed at least 12% of Houston residents, and that same year, the capital of Texas was moved to Austin. By the year 1840, the Buffalo Bayou was deemed too compact to serve the ever-growing vessels of the sea, and Houston by this time was also known for its accumulation of sunken ships on the Buffalo Bayou floor. We're told Houston was considered one of the most violent and lawless cities in North America, and may have led to the concept of the Wild West as we understand it today. When Mexico threatened invasion into Texas in 1842, the capital of Texas was then moved to Houston by Texas President Sam Houston. What stands out most about this? The entire history of Texas was apparently kept in the archives of the capital in Austin. The Austin residents quite literally were willing to die to keep the archives in Austin, which bears the question, what exact information and secrets did these archives truly contain? This led directly to the Texas Archive War of 1842. Essentially, multiple small conflicts occurred when attempting to move these files from Austin to Houston, including an attack in the middle of the night, which led to many of these archives being lost. The narrative continues by stating that Houston, for lack of a better term, was run by elites up until the Civil War, whose families often intermarried to consolidate power. These elite families included that of Thomas W. House. Those living in Houston under the elite class's regime had a perpetual imbalance which the Wild West was known for. The median age was greater than the U.S. at large, and the population was roughly 2/3 male. These males were less likely to be married. We're also told that 1 out of every 3 Houstonians was born abroad, with nearly 75% of these foreign-born residents coming from Germany. The railroads appeared to incorporate Houston into their plans by the 1850s, which was followed by a great divide in wealth and power between the ruling and the working class. In 1859, Houston's railroad was connected to Galveston Island via a viaduct. By 1860, the population of Houston had exceeded 4,400 people. By the outbreak of the Civil War, it was clear that Houston supported secession. By a vote of upwards of 7-1, Houstonians supported the Confederacy. Houston was quintessential to the Confederacy. serving as a military logistics center, the quartermaster depot for Texas, and the headquarters of the most important administrative district of the South, which included Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Houston was said to have suffered 0 attacks or damage during the American Civil War, another statistical anomaly. We're told during the war that many Jewish merchants fled from Houston, greatly altering the population, and these merchants were almost exclusively replaced by businessmen from New Orleans, of French or Creole origin. Here is where we have another interesting tidbit in this narrative. We're told Houston was then occupied following the war by a great influx of free African Americans. While that is normal for a post-war narrative, we're also told these new residents to Houston occupied the dozens of brick and masonry buildings that were abandoned during the war, which is even far more remarkable given Houston was not damaged, captured, or evacuated during the war. By 1869, Houston was well known as one of Texas's leading cities for shipbuilding, and the Ship Canal Company was formed in the city to facilitate the arrival of migrants looking for jobs in the industry. Texas merchants and businessmen also poured large sums of money into expanding the Houston Railroad, which further spearheaded economic growth to the region. Texas was only readmitted to the Union in April of 1870, but by this time, Houston had already become a hub of American trade. The first Texas State Fair in history was held in Houston in 1870. By 1872, Houston had a fully functional streetcar system in place to traverse the city. Houston was one of the most rapidly growing cities in Texas, with a population of 9,300 residents in 1870 and a growth rate of over 77%. Lumber was said to be the main export of the city through the end of the 19th century. When Democrats regained control of the Texas government around the year 1880, laws were enacted that greatly disenfranchised African American voters by making it nearly impossible for them to vote. The Democrats also passed Jim Crow laws and effectively enforced segregation. According to the 1890 census, Houston was home to at least 210 factories, which employed over 3,000 workers, with over 1/3 of these individuals working on the railroad. By 1893, 10 unique railroads interconnected in Houston. In September of 1900, a massive hurricane tore through Galveston, leveling the city. The resulting migration saw many of the citizens, businesses, and economy of Galveston move into Houston. The year 1900 census saw Houston's population rise to over 58,000 people. Houston also became the center for Texas's oil companies, and by 1901, the first automobiles in Texas were sold and driven in Houston. Houston was producing upwards of 200,000 barrels of beer per year, which can be attributed heavily to Houston's rich German history. Around the year 1900, 2 major fires devastated Houston, but neither fire deterred Houston's rapid growth. In 1912, the first University of Houston, Rice University, opened its doors, and Houston at this time was considered the skyscraper city of the South. While rather small for our time, Houston in the year 1912 contained at least 25 unique buildings that stood at least 6 stories or at least 60 feet tall, with the loftiest of these buildings being at least 16 stories or 160 feet tall, the tallest of which was known as the Carter Building. In 1917, the Army ordered 2 forts to be built in Houston, Camp Logan and Ellington Field. By August of 1917, these forts became the home to the Camp Logan race riots. Again, we have a slew of Germans whose names repeatedly appear on the history of Houston in the early 20th century. George Kessler designed Herman Park, which housed the zoological gardens on land that was donated by George Herman. The Democratic National Convention was held in Houston in 1928 in a massive convention hall designed by Kenneth Franzheim, which became known as Sam Houston Hall, and when completed, it was larger than the Madison Square Garden. We're told for this convention, several dozen hotels were founded in Houston, and additionally, electric trolley cars were torn down, converted into apartments, and rented out to visitors. Does any of this sound typical to you? By May of 1929, we're told a great flood reached Houston, causing millions of dollars of damages, which we can only assume is close to hundreds of millions of dollars in damages today, as the value of $1 million in 1929 is equivalent to roughly $18.5 million today. By the year 1930 and the great stock market crash in America, Houston had over 290,000 permanent residents, all of whom were said to be mostly unaffected by the crash. Petroleum and oil, not cotton, had reigned supreme in Houston since the late 19th century, and this export of oil made Houston an oil powerhouse which continued well into the 20th century. Houston and the state of Texas celebrated their centennials in 1936. When World War II began, Houston was said to be greatly affected. Seemingly, the whole concept of Houston was reimagined. By 1940, 5 of Houston's exclusive shipping lines completely ended their service. By April of 1940, a large number of Houston streetcars, by that time electric, were torn down. The tracks were covered over and replaced with bus lines. Robertson Stadium was built in 1941 and was made for the public school of Houston. All the while, this stadium is large enough, even today, to host professional sporting events. By 1950, the Texas Medical Center opened in Houston, and the now Hobby Airport increased flights to and from this major metropolis of Texas. In 1951, the Shriners Hospital and Texas Children's Hospital opened in Houston, and on July 4th, 1962, NASA opened the Manned Space Center in Houston, greatly impacting the local market and awarding thousands of new jobs to the area. In 1965, the Astrodome opened, the first multi-purpose dome stadium in the entire world, which set the precedence for numerous other sports stadiums that followed. The word Houston was the first word said on the moon by American astronaut Neil Armstrong on July 20th, 1969. In 2001, Enron, a Houston-based energy company, collapsed after being caught in numerous national scandals, leading to dozens of arrests and millions of dollars in fines. Houston is repeatedly the victim of massive flooding and weather events caused by major hurricanes, with the most recent being Hurricane Harvey, which caused $125 billion in damages. Yet somehow, Houston continues to carry on, continues to grow to this day, and is becoming one of the largest and most important cities in America.